On this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Michael Ness. Michael started out as a mainstream member of the LDS Church and even served a mission. He has since become a Mormon Fundamentalist. In this episode, not only do we go over his backstory, but we also talk about how deeper doctrines and the higher ordinances of the gospel point and bind us to Christ. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Well, Michael, I can't appreciate you enough for being here. Were you born a fundamentalist?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I personally, well, in reflection on my upbringing, I kind of think I was a hair's breadth away from being raised that way. Both my families come from pretty much darn near pure pioneer stock. At least on both of my grandmothers' sides of the family, and so it wasn't the worst jump in the world towards going towards fundamentalism, because I was raised very traditionally.
Okay, so when you say traditional, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean traditional in a Mormon context, right? So there's like traditional, which is what you and I are, like way traditional, and then there's like LDS traditional. So tell me about your traditional LDS upbringing.
All right, I guess with a little bit of family history might help with it, and I'll try to condense it. But my mom's mom was from Vernal, Utah, and she remembers apostles and presidents of the church like David O. McKay and Ezra Taft Benson and these people coming and just speaking in their ward, out in Vernal. And, she's told me, I knew President McKay very well, and I knew Ezra Taft Benson really well. And when she graduated high school, she moved out to Washington, D.C. And because Benson was in politics and living in D.C. at the time, he was in the cabinet for President Eisenhower.
Right.
And so President Benson, Apostle Benson at the time, was in her ward, and so I knew President Benson very well, and so that's kind of was very interesting for her, and telling me stories and teaching me things about what she knew growing up. And so the answers to questions were always very fundamentalistic.
Right.
And with my dad, for example, his dad, wasn't an active member of the church, but would tell him, and point him towards Isaiah and say, like, there's a prophecy here, 7 women would take hold of one man, in the last days. And, his dad told him, the church will have polygamy restored. And so my father told me that, right? And so those are the answers. Those are the beliefs that I was kind of raised with.
So like plural marriage wasn't like a taboo subject in your home?
No, it really wasn't. The only thing I heard was from the women. My grandma, the same grandma that I mentioned about knowing President Benson, would say stuff like, I'm so grateful I don't have to live that law in this life, and I can wait to live it in the next one. Stuff like that. And so she's like, I know it's an eternal law, but I'm just grateful that the prophets said we don't have to live it now. So gotcha. That's like the distinction between.
Okay. And how did you, let's say stuff on Adam God, was that ever floated in the house?
No, Ned, no one had any idea about Adam God until I brought that into the house.
So you're the one that started it.
Yeah, I got off my mission. And we can get into that story and that background more if we want to, but I got off my mission.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's back up for just a second. So you're raised in this very traditional LDS home. I imagine your folks are going to the temple monthly. I imagine that you guys have your 8 bins of wheat down in the store cellar, right? I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I do still. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I got a ton of it. But the other thing is that you guys are all watching conference on conference weekend, and family home evening. All that's probably an Eagle Scout by the time you were 14 or 15. I'm guessing. Am I hitting these?
Yeah, those are goals for sure that was expected. I made Life Scout with most of my badges before I was 15.
Okay, all right, just checking. And see, for me, I think I'll always, to some degree, feel like a little bit of an outsider in Mormonism, even though I believe it wholeheartedly. But because I spent, the first 18 years of my life outside of Mormonism, it's always interesting to hear those stories, right? Because that just wasn't in my lexicon whatsoever, any of that stuff, right? I did have some LDS friends, but by and large, I mean, I wasn't exposed to it. So you do that. Obviously, a mission is expected, right? You're going to go on a mission for the church. So when you go out on a mission, are you able to tell, like, ooh, maybe I was raised even a little bit different than the other missionaries around me?
Oh, absolutely. And so let's back up even further. So I got to the point where I was about 15 years old, and I basically was like fed up with how traditional my parents were with Mormonism. And I kind of just was like, I would rather focus on other aspects of my life right now. And, and so I go to ward meetings and stuff, but any extracurricular activities, I would try to dodge as much as possible,
So you're skipping mutual, right? I mean,
right, and all that, as much as I could get away with in my late teenage years.
Right.
And so when I graduated high school, I really didn't have a testimony. And I didn't get it until I was about 19, turning 20. And then, the world kind of changed for me. And I decided, like, okay, I want to go serve a mission, because I gained that testimony that, okay, this is something I want to share. I want to share the fruits of the gospel.
Okay, back up. Tell me about that. Tell me about that moment when you're like, oh man, the gospel's true, right? This isn't just cultural. This has validity. This has chops, right? What was that moment?
All right, that we'll have to kind of back up more into this teenage years for this to make full sense. So, like I said, I'm kind of looking for an excuse not to be involved as much as possible in my late teenage years. And so I find the CES letter when I'm 17, and I start reading it. And in it, you got this Adam God thing, And so that was like the first time I brought it up to family, like if I believe. And so then I started. Long story short, about 2 years later, I'm 19, and I take this issue to my grandparents and to my home teacher, or their home teacher, who was a chaplain in the U.S. Army. Mm-hmm. And to be a chaplain in the U.S. Army, you need to have a psychology degree. And he was really interesting because, being an LDS chaplain, he was put in a career where all the other chaplains in the Army were pretty much Protestant or Catholic or something else that all hated Mormons. And so he was put in this position of, like, he was being antied all the time, and he didn't know all this anti-Mormon literature and every apologetic possible for members of the church that were in the Army. So he talked to me about Adam God, and he basically said, Michael, Brigham Young did say that he got a revelation on it, and here's my advice. My advice is that you can study this. You can try to understand what Brigham Young received through revelation, but I warn you that it does not seem to be scriptural, and I would not teach it. But feel free to study it, And that was a pretty good. That's
a real good answer, actually, right? Because that does two things. It doesn't shut you down entirely and make the doctrine seem like bootleg whiskey, if you will, right? At the same time, it's like, don't teach this, or you're going to end up in the stake president's office.
Right. And so I had that on my shelf when I went on my mission, and it just kind of always nagged me in the back of my brain. And eventually, on our P days, our preparation days, when we're emailing families and we have access to the computers in the church offices, I would, go on fairmormon.org, and they find that they had links to the Journal of Discourses. And I would go and look up every talk from Brigham Young or Orson Pratt on topics that I wanted to research, and I'd copy and paste them and email them to myself so that I could just read them off of my tablet throughout the week. And so I did my studies my extracurricular studies out of the scriptures and obtained the Journal of Discourses that way. And I'd go through the scriptures and I'd try to, so I knew what Brigham Young said about Adam God, as much as, but I still had questions. And I'd go through the scriptures and try to see it. And like, yeah, it's kind of there, but it's not enough. And I'd pray about it. And I wanted to know. I really wanted to know. But then I got to a ward or a branch out in the middle of nowhere on the shores of Lake Superior in Wisconsin, called Ashland. And the branch was throwing away books. And so I went through and said, okay, maybe there's something in here if they're throwing them out, I can find something that's valuable in here. And I found a copy of the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith. And right, this was about 8 months before the end of my mission. About 8 months from the end of my mission, I get to page 157 in that area where it starts giving that priesthood discourse about Adam. Right. And the Spirit hit me and told me, the Father, Adam is the father of your spirits, or your spirit. And I was filled with this feeling of joy. I was so ecstatic after having put that much thought and that much prayer into it. And for it to hit me unexpected when I was reading something from Joseph Smith and not from Brigham Young, and have it hit me that way when I wasn't even really, I wasn't looking for it at that moment. And I just wanted to run and tell my companion and tell the district leader and his companion that were living in that apartment. And it took pretty much everything, in me not to go and get myself in trouble right then and there.
Gotcha. So this is interesting. So is your conversion to the gospel as a whole a direct result of gaining a testimony of the Adam God Doctrine?
No, I wouldn't say that. My testimony as a whole came in two major slaps to the face, very close to each other, where I was, like I said, I was distancing myself from Mormonism, becoming kind of agnostic, and I love religion, I love philosophy, and I was studying Hinduism at the time, and I was studying just history of religion and different religions and all sorts of fun philosophies and stuff. And I was trying to date a girl who was a member of the church, and I was trying to push my nonchalant or agnostic kind of attitude on her. And she really pushed me back on, no, I have a testimony of the gospel. And it just hit me one day, talking to her, where I just said to myself, you know what, she's kind of right. Either it's true, the gospel's true, the Book of Mormon's true, that kind of, and if it's true, I have nothing to lose, and if it's wrong, I have nothing to lose, Right. I'm at that point in my life where it's like, okay, if the promise doesn't hold up, it doesn't change anything. But if it's true, that would change everything. That would change the way I want to live my life. And I got to that point where I just started reading. And that first slap in the face I mentioned was when I got to 2 Nephi chapter 2, where it starts talking about opposition in all things. And it became incredibly just, I perceived that was the most profound philosophical treatise on human existence I'd ever read at that point. And it has smacked me with truth. And then I read 2 chapters later, the 2 Nephi chapter 4, which is, I found out later, called by some people the Psalm of Nephi, where he's literally pouring his heart out.
Oh, wretched man that I am. And
his father just died, and his brothers are trying to kill him. And he's having to take everyone that believes and flee. And he is in the depths of his own personal hell. And it resonated so much with me that the one question I asked myself was like, could Joseph Smith have written something this powerful from another man's perspective? Right. I just felt it so deeply and it moved me so much. And the Spirit was just, with those two things back to back, that close, it completely gave me that testimony and that, almost a baptism of fire type thing. And I said, I want to share this and I want to go on a mission,
So now I'm going to ask you kind of a question here for a dichotomy, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. Do you ever remember a time when maybe you were praying or something like that, and you asked to know if the gospel was true or if the LDS Church was God's true church? Or did you just make the assumption that the LDS Church was the only place to have Mormonism dispensed to you, so to speak?
Well, I think that was a partial assumption, but I also knew that I could just go into the mission field through the church, and that's what I wanted to do after I read that, was just go on a mission. And so that was why argue with the mechanism that's already provided that way.
Right.
But I will tell you that about 6 months out on my mission, I started asking that question once I was confronted with other groups, and especially being out in the Midwest,
right,
where they have the community of Christ and other breakoff groups from in the Restoration. And I started praying about things, and I was reading D&C 132 about 6 months out, and I wanted to know, like, was this of God? Was Wilford Woodruff a prophet of God? Could a prophet of God issue the manifesto, and was it a revelation? I was starting to wonder all those things.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I asked the Lord after a good study of D&C 132 and Official Declaration 1, but I asked the wrong question. I asked the Lord, is Wilford Woodruff a prophet of God? And of course he answered and told me, yeah, Wilford Woodruff's a prophet of God. And I was so satisfied with that, and I just kept working on my mission, but it was the wrong question. But I was laboring under an assumption that prophets were infallible. Truly, if you were chosen by God, like God would, like Wilford Woodruff would say later, like, God will not suffer me to lead this people astray. Right. He will remove me out of my place.
So a couple things there. The reason I asked the question is because of my own experience, and the more fundamentalists I talk to, I'm starting to see a pattern emerge, which is typically, I know, and this is what I did, I prayed to know if the gospel was true. And I never mentioned the church in that. I just assumed that this was the only place where Mormonism was dispensed, was in the LDS Church. Right? So I asked if the gospel is true. Well, yes, the gospel is true. Is the Book of Mormon true? Yes, the Book of Mormon is a true is a true piece of scripture. Well, if that's the case, and this church is handing it to me, and they are dispensing, quote, Mormonism, then the church by default has to be true. And the more fundamentalists I talk about and kind of get their backstory, the more I find that's typically how this works, right? It's very rarely do I hear someone say, I prayed to know if the LDS Church was the Lord's one true church. It was always, is the gospel true? Is the Book of Mormon true? Was Joseph Smith a prophet? And then it's that assumption that hey, this is where Mormonism is dispensed, that leads people to the LDS Church. And so I just wanted to get your opinion on that. As far as Wilford Woodruff goes, it took me probably a good 7 years before I could say Woodruff was a true prophet. And the reason I can say that is probably because, I'll be honest with you, I think Wilford Woodruff phrased the manifesto just the right way so that it was never a revelation and never a commandment to cease practicing plural marriage. He never comes out and says stop. He said, it's my advice we stop. Right? So he's very careful in that. And it took me a long time to be able to find sympathy for him. Right? Because I feel like he's in a horrible position. He's watching people go to jail. He's watching families being torn apart. His predecessor dies in hiding, right? And so they're threatening to seize the temple. And these days I feel for Wilford a lot. Now, having said that, I will say that he did compromise, right? I mean, John Taylor had revelations that said, stay close to the Lord. I've decreed things. You stick to it. And under that pressure, I mean, look, we can all sit back and say, I wouldn't have done that, but we don't know, right? I mean, you have the full force of the United States government not just coming after you, but coming after all the people you were trying to be a shepherd to, that's a different ball of wax.
It is so hard to be in his position. And, and he would say stuff about 2 years earlier in 1888 that he would rather attend a funeral than attend a quorum meeting with the quorum of the 12 apostles at that point, because they were so wrapped up in the political machinations of getting statehood and fighting for the civil liberties of their people, and also trying to maintain the integrity of their religion and of the temples, and you continue with the ordinances. And there's so many elements that go into that, and I do not envy his position whatsoever. Some people were saying that they would wish that a younger man could be chosen as president of the church, before they reorganized the first presidency. And and John W. Taylor, I think it was an April conference of 1890, basically said the reason we're not getting revelations right now is because we're all too concerned about our temporal affairs and making money, talking about the brethren,
right?
And yeah, so it's just that was a tough time.
That was a tough time, and I tend to have a little more sympathy for him. Anyway, sorry, I was a bit of a tangent. So you're able to read, you're able to gain this answer that Wilford Woodruff was a prophet, and so that I'm guessing that kind of puts any concerns you have to bed about finishing your mission, right? Because it sounds like you're kind of starting to question some stuff as far as the LDS Church while you're on your mission. But that answer kind of smooths everything over that allows you to finish your mission. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. And even my Adam God revelation, what would that be? 8 months after that, or so, didn't do anything besides, didn't really make me think the church was an apostasy necessarily at the moment. Just that this wasn't being taught at the moment, and I kind of just resolved to put it back on the shelf, and I'll go study out what Brigham Young and others said about this when I get off my mission. And so back to this, your first question of was Adam God ever brought into my home? I brought it in when I got off my mission. I told my dad, look, this is what I found in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. This is what Brigham Young said.
Hold on one second. So let's finish the mission first here, right?
Oh, okay.
Is there anything else that happens as far as the mission, right? That is of note or noteworthy or anything like that?
The only thing personally that happened I could think of was I dreaded getting off and returning to being an unproductive and unsaintly individual. And so I was just praying and I said, Lord, I've seen my companions that I've had get home, and they've lost interest in the gospel, or they've become inactive after getting a girlfriend or whatever. I've been out for months. I'm at the end of my mission now, and I've seen all these people that once they're off their mission, they've, about half of them or more over time end up quickly even, having or either they go off and say, I don't want to attend my meetings anymore because I just did it for 2 years straight over the top, or they just became very worldly. And their pursuits of the gospel was, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to do summer sales and I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to do this and this and this. And this is my plan to be a stake president by the time I'm 30 years old. And, and so there's like these two extremes. And I just was asking the Lord, like, please just help me obtain a witness for myself that will prevent me from apostatizing one way or the other, And that was my prayer. And the Lord showed me some things, gave me a personal testimony of the first vision and of the very literal nature of Christ giving his life on the cross for us as an atonement. And that was very much that thing that I asked for, that I would have that witness necessary for me to keep me on a path moving forward and not get distracted once I got off my mission from building up the kingdom of God.
Gotcha. So when you got off your mission, did you have any idea that you'd end up going fundamentalist?
I began to wonder because I saw the apologetics and things said by the church leaders about Adam God when I just knew, frankly, the apologetics were 90% all lies, just false statements. And it's a big question to me that, like, in John 17, it says, "Behold, this is life eternal, to know the only true God and Jesus Christ whom you sent." So if the church doesn't know the identity of God, it's not a good situation to be in. Also, I think it's in D&C 112, where it says, "My judgments will begin on my house wherein you have profaned and blasphemed my name."
Mm-hmm.
So knowing the correct name of God and the correct character of God. Joseph Smith said that too. It is the first principle to know the character of God.
Right.
So I kind of wondered what was going to happen there, and so I was planning on going to college at BYUI, and it's a stone's throw from Utah,
Mm-hmm.
and I had resolved to start talking to fundamentalists in Utah once I moved to Idaho.
Okay, so you've already decided once you're off your mission. Did you know you were going to BYU Idaho before you got off your mission?
Mm-hmm.
No. Okay.
But it was pretty soon.
Okay. All right. So you, if nothing else happens, you get off your mission, and then take me through the progression of how it is you became a Mormon fundamentalist.
All right. So, I found a Facebook page that at the time was just called the Church of the Firstborn. And it was run by a man that you have actually interviewed already named Jacob Vidrine. And he and I started talking over Facebook Messenger. And I started attending meetings with them in Orem. And then I, over time, just became acquainted with other people. There's like an interesting intersectionality. Like there's all these circles within circles. And I'm sure that you've seen that. Like,
yep.
Once you meet a new person, or they acquaint you with all of their circle, but then like he's also part of another circle with other friends that he can kind of introduce you to that. Then you learn by different chain links, all these different, and so that began to happen exponentially, where I started attending meetings with the branch at Ben Schaefer's house in York for a time. I would talk with Jordan Peterson and some of his companions. And I understand he has different companions now than when I first met him over 2 years ago.
Actually, Jordan was just released off his mission this weekend, so he's
God bless that. He's done it. Dude, he's been serving a long time. He served, I think, twice as long as I probably did for the church.
I'm not sure how long he served, but yeah, he's been out a while. So
I think it was nearly 4 years. That's amazing.
He was the missionary that came over to talk to me when I joined the branch. So yeah. And that was just about a year ago.
Well, anyway, shout out to Jordan Peterson if you hear this.
That's right.
And
you got to be careful, because there's like Jordan Peterson, like make your bed Jordan Peterson.
Sure.
And then you have
Well, you and I know, and others will know who we're talking about.
Right, yeah. So you just kind of start attending meetings, and as you're saying, there's overlap, right? You just start. Right. I've always said in these circles, I mean, once you know 3 or 4 people, you're kind of connected. It's like that old Kevin Bacon game, right? 8 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon.
Right. And Jacob and I started working together as carpenters in Orem, and we had a job site in Santaquin, Utah. And Kevin Kraut lived in Santaquin, and so every once in a while I'd pop in and go talk to Kevin. And he would, every once in a while, he'd give me a few books or something, and I always appreciated that. And at the time, this was all going on, I started writing a letter to my family, about like, this is like almost Martin Luther style, like 95 Theses. This is why the church has departed from the,
I could just see you like tapping that letter to the front door of your house and then knocking and taking off. So,
and I never sent it to them. I still haven't to this day. I've never sent it to them. I started it in, I think, April or August of 2019, and I started writing it, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it ended up being like over 50 pages or something. And I've never sent it to my family, but I fully intended to, as I was living in Utah or living in Idaho. Then I moved to Utah, ended up working with Jacob, as I said. And I was writing this letter the whole time about how I'm going to drop this bomb to my family about how I'm pursuing fundamentalism. Then COVID happened, and then it's March of 2020, I believe, that's about that area. And the Lord told me move back to home, go back to, and so I moved back to Seattle where my family was living, and what blew my mind, because at the time you had the Black Lives Matter and Antifa stuff going on, and Chaz was like right in downtown. All that was going on top of COVID, and I didn't want to be in a city, but the Lord told me to go, so I went. And I had some profound experiences there that led me to the path that I'm on now. I ended up taking a job in South Dakota logging, and I lived with a polygamist family that was associated with the AUB for a long time.
Okay.
Yep. And then through them, I met Drew Briney, who I think probably several people who listen to, or know about fundamentalism will know Drew Briney and books that he's published. And, and so, and he was living in Missouri. And so I went down to Missouri, and that's how I'm here.
So at what point you realize you're full-fledged, right? You're no longer LDS, you are a Mormon fundamentalist? Because I don't know about you, but there was a crystallization of that moment for me where I remember, well, I guess that's what I am, right? I'm a Mormon fundamentalist. Was there ever like a moment, or was it just kind of gradual? There were certain moments that were definitive, but different things pertaining to it. There were definitive moments for each different point, I think, but the whole thing had been gradual. The first time I ever received a rebaptism was August or September of 2018. And so that's a fundamentalistic thing, and so that was the first thing, right? And then as far as actually, getting into fundamentalism, and then attending meetings, and having sacrament with fundamentalists that, where that was acceptable, around the same time that was done. But yeah, at that point around 2019, the early part of 2019, I was living in Rexburg, Idaho still. I pretty much decided that the church was going the opposite direction that it was necessary to move in to build the kingdom of God, and right.
And I realized that I need to work somewhere else, and I need to find the best place where I can lift and stand,
Gotcha.
and do my part.
Gotcha. Does your family know that you're a fundamentalist now?
Oh yeah.
How'd that go down?
Well, I think it was partially softened by my slow approach with things like Adam God, and I talked to my dad about law of consecration and how I'd like to have a property with my brother and my sister and their families and dad in the future, and kind of have this, where we can live the law of consecration that we covenant to live in the temple. Even still today, in the church, they covenant to live that. And so he was all for that one, by the way. He was like, oh yeah, we covenant that one. We should live that law, and not knowing that or even knowing that there's not an avenue to practice that in the church, and not knowing that that's kind of the big focus of a lot of fundamentalist groups, because that's one of the core principles. So it was softened by degrees. I was kind of leaving this breadcrumb trail of fundamentalism for them, but the final moment was when I introduced them to some polygamists. And
did you bring them over for dinner, or when you mean introduce them?
We were at a family reunion in Kaysville, Utah.
Okay.
And I took my dad to meet Tom Green before he died, because I was in the process of interviewing Tom Green. I was living in Orem still. This is before COVID, I believe, and I'd have to check my journal or whatever, or the dates of those interviews. In any case, I was back in Utah, and I had been interviewing Tom Green before I left Utah for Washington at some point, and I had established that I was just talking about his history, getting that angle. I was pretty much trying to talk to most fundamentalists who would talk to me. I talked to Antonio Trevisan down in Ephraim from the Church of the Firstborn background as well. At that around that time, I was talking a bunch. I was trying to interview a bunch of people, but he was by that. Tom Green was close by, and I figured, all right, we're gonna see what happens. I'll bring my dad and have lunch with Tom Green.
Right.
And
let me ask you this. So I'm seeing a lot of LeBarons in our discussion here. Do you identify as kind of like from that lineage, so to speak, that priesthood lineage?
I have a lot of friends from that lineage, and there's a little bit of history there. And I did associate with the Church of the Firstborn for a while, and the Lord has led me to pursue some other things at the moment, but I don't discredit anything good that was given me. Gotcha. And any perspective. And honestly, there are things and testimonies that I have and blessings that and truths that I know that will forever enrich and bless my life that I learned through them. And I'm very grateful that the Lord led me there to teach me, to teach me truth, and, but there are things that I didn't expect to kind of lead me out from that association for at least a time. Who knows what will happen with some of those individuals in the future. Right.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's good. So then you head down to Missouri, right? And then when you go down to Missouri, are you married at that time or?
Nope. No, I was not. I was a single man. Menace to society, as they say.
Yeah. What was the old quote by Brigham Young? I think it was like a bachelor over the age of 18 was a menace to society or
something like that. I've heard varying numbers, and I've read funny talks from the Journal of Discourses like him saying, if there's a man over 18 that's not married, I want him out of the territory,
I love Brigham. I really do. I love Brigham. I've always said I wish I was as sweet and as charismatic as Joseph Smith, but unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately. I mean, I just identify more with Brigham. I mean, get your butt in the wagon. We're going to cross the plains, and I don't want to hear any complaining, right? So,
I'm the same way. The practical application of the gospel speaks to me.
Yep, it does to me as well. So, all right. So you move out there now. You're married now, right?
Yep.
How long?
Since February 5th, however long that is now.
Wow. About 3 months.
Yep.
February, March, April. Yeah, 3 months. Nice. Congratulations. So you met your wife in Missouri then?
Yep.
And she's a fundamentalist too, I take it?
Yep. Raised in a family that came out of the AUB. Yep.
Nice. Well, good deal, man. That's awesome. So when now we kind of know a little bit about you. When you and I first talked, you said that you had been thinking a lot about how fundamentalist principles tie us back to Christ.
Yes.
And you kind of have a list here, and we're going to hit at least some of them, and then we're just going to kind of see where this goes. But the first one on your list was Adam God. So I want to focus on that because I think too often, and I think this happens more in the LDS Church than it does in with fundamentalists, because fundamentalists typically want the whole enchilada, right? They don't want just the fries or just the burger. They want the full meal deal, so to speak. If you could see my stomach, you'd understand why I make the food analogy. But we tend to want the whole thing, not just whatever piece. Within the LDS Church, a lot of times you find people who specialize in things, right? Like Sister Smith may be really good at genealogy, and that's her gospel hobby. And then there's another guy who's really into church history and really into obscure teachings, and that's his thing. And then another one's into temple, right? So with these things, I think sometimes people can get wrapped up in just the doctrine themselves, right? Rather than how is the doctrine applicable at strengthening my relationship with Christ and with our Heavenly Father. And so when you pitched that idea, I was all for it, because I think as fundamentalists, we really do need to make a good case on we are Christ-centered, right? At the end of the day, we're about Jesus Christ and about our Heavenly Father and about the gospel that encompasses all of that. So let's just take Adam God. Let's start there. And the reason I want to start there, and I know I've quoted it on the show before, so I'm sure there's going to be some folks who roll their eyes, but I don't quote Catholic theologians a whole bunch. I can't remember who it was, but it was out of one of my mom's old books on Catholicism. And there was a guy in there who said that every heresy begins with a misconception of who God is. So explain to me as best you can, how does Adam God tie us to Christ? How does that point us back towards Christ?
I'd like to preface my remarks on that by just a little quickly. You said that it seems like in fundamentalism or in the church that some people can get wrapped up in the doctrines. And that was actually one of the biggest concerns with me as I got into fundamentalism, was I saw people who had studied themselves out of the church, and people in the church were warning me at the same time, if you don't stop studying, you're going to study yourself out of the church. And I saw people who had done that in fundamentalism, and they were so into the doctrines and perfectly systematizing how all these doctrines relate to each other, that their children were squandering in unbelief because they did not understand the gospel of Christ. They did not understand the first principles.
Right.
Have you seen that at all?
So my not really, and I'm going to tell you why. First off, my route to fundamentalism was first just being an independent, right? So I didn't have that same exposure that maybe you did. Now, having said that, in the last year I joined the branch, right? And I will say this: the branch seems to be very balanced in their approach. So I haven't got where because some branches of fundamentalism really glom on hard to law of adoption, right? Some branches really glom on hard to plural marriage. Some glom on hard to whatever it is. But you'll notice there's some flavors, and that was one of the things that attracted me to Christ Church. And I don't mean to shamelessly plug here, because that's not the point. But so I didn't get that a lot, right? Is that within Christ Church, everything is pretty balanced and everything has a place. And if you're trying to live the fullness, that, that's, in my estimation, how it should be.
Yeah, I think that is exactly how it should be. And I noticed that people who were fundamentalists that had converted from the church had a very good center about them. But people who grew up in fundamentalism, like the kids who grew up consistently in fundamentalism, didn't have the same understanding of the doctrine of Christ that I grew up with, or that I acquired through the church in my early 20s serving a mission. And so that was my question: is, okay, if I'm going to be a fundamentalist, how do I center all these doctrines back towards Christ? And how do, systematizing them and perfectly aligning all the nuances and who said what is fine, and that's fun to do sometimes. I don't think it's entirely fully possible, but you cannot just systematize a cosmology and not live the gospel in your home. And anyway, so that off that tangent, in the scriptures, you have certain statements like, I am your Lord Jesus Christ, who stood in the midst of eternity among the seraphic hosts of heaven before the world was made, or that, or in DNC, that's in DNC 38. In DNC 76, it says that all the worlds were created through him, by him, and so you have a serious paradox with later Mormon teachings in Nauvoo and with Adam God, in that you have this genealogy of gods. And how is it then that Christ is the creator of all these worlds and all the things that are in them? So what Adam God does first off is make you question that. And it makes you say, okay, hold up. There's something here where there's this entire lineage, this entire genealogy, this family tree of exalted beings, and that we come from them literally, but that through the fall we've been kind of divorced from them, right? And so Christ is this mediator, and he's this link to kind of, as Jacob chapter 5 has this allegory of the graft, right? Grafting the branches back into the tree, and so Christ grafts us through oath and covenant through the priesthood back into the genealogy and family tree of the gods. First off, there's that. But still, then you have these scriptures, and how is this reconciled? And it's very interesting. It was pointed out to me that in Hebrews chapter 7, there's a discourse given on Melchizedek, and the author of the Hebrews is trying to preface how Christ came after the order of the Melchizedek priesthood, when the Jews were familiar with the Levitical priesthood at the time. And so he goes on to say that Melchizedek was so great a man that even our father Abraham paid tithes to him, because the Jews were obsessed with genealogy and coming from Abraham. So Melchizedek, who was a pattern of Christ, was so great Abraham paid tithes to him. But then he goes on further to say, but even the Levites, whose job it is to collect the tithes from all the people, but when they collect the tithes from Israel, essentially, they are paying tithes to Melchizedek. And he says, now how is that possible? Levi didn't even know Melchizedek. And discerning that the author or the reader would not be kind of questioning how Levi could pay tithes to Melchizedek, he goes on to explain, because Levi was yet in the loins of his father Abraham when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And so there's this principle that's really interesting, I find, that with procreation and with the creation of, with spiritual procreation, and becoming the literal sons and daughters of God, and with this literal genealogy and this family tree, that our father was in his father and was in his father and was in his father. And so when Christ says that he created all the worlds, it's just the same thing as Levi paying tithes to Melchizedek, because he was within the loins of his father.
Gotcha.
And so it's very interesting, that he's the possessor of those blessings. He is the possessor of those things, and and he is in that mediating position for us. But it's almost literally true in that we were there too. We are connected. We're essentially the sum total of all the attributes of our ancestors, even the gods that we come. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think that does show who Christ is at that moment. And it also it throws way more light to me on the identity of Christ and his relationship to us, Christ's relationship to his father, and the father's relationship to us.
Okay. All right. I guess I can see that, because I know, I remember I had, when in my process of, and I lived and people who've went to the backstory episode of the podcast where I talk about who I was, I jumped into Plural Marriage, and then I learned about the rest. Right. Mm-hmm. And, I remember talking to somebody on this journey out of the LDS Church, and just, admitting to myself I was a fundamentalist, that I was talking to someone about the Adam God, and they said, well, that really doesn't point you to Christ, right? I mean, you're talking about, how does that help you in your daily walk and your discipleship, with this supposed knowledge about, Adam and / Michael being God? How does that help anchor you to Christ? And that was something I always struggled with. Now, I felt it, but it was really hard for me at that young point in my life where I'm converting to fundamentalism, of being able to express it.
Okay, maybe let me take another angle on that one then. Maybe this will help. To me, I resonate with this, and I hope that I can articulate it in such a way that it helps make sense of what I said earlier, if that didn't make sense, and I hope it ties together really well. But so in the Endowment, you see three characters named Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael. And so there are elements of the Adam God Doctrine clearly in the Endowment, but I think it's more interesting when you look at yourself and you look at the archetypes that those are supposed to represent. And the Endowment tells you that you are supposed to consider yourself respectively, at males for Adam, females for Eve. But with the Adam God doctrine, we understand that Michael was already an exalted being, and he was married, sealed, had the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, all those things. But we are going through life without that, but we're trying to obtain that position, to return to that position that he occupies. I believe personally that when we do that, if we consider ourselves Adam and Eve, and we get to be the position where we are a God unit after this life, a man and wife or wives, that you become as a unit synonymous with Michael in the next life, and Jesus then will be Jehovah to you, as Jehovah is to Michael in the Endowment.
Right.
And so when I look at the Endowment, I see Jesus, or I see Jehovah as Father Adam's Christ that redeemed him. And so it's typical of this relationship that Christ, as your mediator, as he's our mediator on this world, he will always be there for us, and he will be our counselor when we take on that position of Michael in the next life. And our father Adam, will take the position of Elohim, relative to us. And so the Adam God doctrine is essentially this, that whether you're Elohim, Jehovah, or Michael, all gods are Adam relative to the worlds that are theirs.
Right.
Even though Jesus Christ will be Jehovah to me and to you, he will be Adam to his own world at the same time.
Right.
Right. That is right. And so they become descriptors of the relationships that the gods have. And I think that's a beautiful thing too, is that it shows that the gods counsel with each other.
Right. And I think it also, so there's several things here that really appeal to me. One is that this idea that these are almost familiar, and that meaning in terms of family titles, right? And in many ways, right? And so your dad never stops being your dad just because he becomes your son's grandfather. He's always your dad, right?
Right.
The other thing that I really like about the Adam God doctrine is first, it personalizes God in such a way that no longer are you left to wonder, could he be the God of the deists, right? Is he that distant God, that clockmaker that just makes the clock, winds it up, and then watches? That doesn't compute for most of us because, and I know there's some folks that had a bad relationship with their dad, and I get that, but by and large, he's involved, right? I love my children. You're going to experience it at some point, having children, and the love you feel for your child is the most, and I don't say this in like an evolutionary or savage kind of way. It is the most primal love I think an individual can feel is to your children. I'll just give you an example. When my first son was born, he had some massive problems, and they had to take him to the ICU. And I watched, and it was so strange because I was young. I was like 18, 19. And I watched him poking my son and causing him to cry, and everything in me, even though I knew here, and I knew in my head that what they were doing was to save his life, hearing him cry and watching someone around him triggered something, right? And I got to go protect him. I got to go get him, right? So we all have that as parents. I think that really primal space that's placed within us for our children. If we feel that as mortal and corruptible and fallen in a certain sense, if I feel that way, then how does a father with perfect love, with perfect understanding, with perfect compassion, how does he feel about us? Right? Mm-hmm. And so, because he's not only the father of our spirits, he's the father of our bodies as well, right? I mean, these are all very, very human things. And if there's one thing I love about the Adam God doctrine and about how Joseph Smith described God, it's that he takes God and he, well, by this knowledge of the Adam God doctrine, it elevates us right? To the sense that our humanity doesn't have to be unholy. Our humanity can be holy in that sense. The other thing I would say is that it gives us proximity to the gods.
It does.
Not distant any longer, not some unremoved force. I mean, if you follow the doctrines of the Trinity, right, it almost seems like God is, and I'm going to nerd out here for a second, it makes God sound almost like the Force from Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Just out there, this thing, this we know it can love, but it's really got no parts or passions. No, the Adam God Doctrine puts us in proximity to God. We know the relationship.
Yeah, it completely adds clarity to the scripture in the New Testament where it says that when we see him, we shall see him as he is, for he shall be like us. You know, and it makes complete sense now, why that is because if we're the ones seeing him, it's because it's not only because we are physically in the same image, but and that's a component of it, but because we've qualified ourselves to have the same attributes as him, but we have made ourselves in the same image spiritually, but we are truly in the same image literally as well.
Yeah. No, and when you tie in this fact of eternal progression, right? All of a sudden, seeing Christ in that light anchors us more. Because now, and we're taught this in LDS circles to a degree, and I say to a degree because it still makes Christ almost unapproachable, right? The older brother, so to speak. But
right.
within Mormonism, within fundamentalist Mormonism, he is very much our brother, right? He's in it with us because of this idea of eternal progression. He's in the trenches with us.
Right. I fully agree with that. Isn't that like we are co-heirs with Christ? We are, as you said, in the trenches with him, and it's he's the general, to be sure.
Absolutely.
But he's the one fighting and fought the battle, won the battle, and it says in the scriptures that we get to be co-heirs with Christ. And being co-heirs with Christ means that we get to be co-heirs with our Father. And from the endowment, you see when you look at it in an eternal perspective, you see that God had co-heirs in a different generation of time, and that we're regrafting ourselves that way, and so the blessings. Another thing I like to say is the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the blessings of Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I've never heard that, but yeah, that's a perfect way. And it by no means diminishes the role of Christ. I think it only enhances just how important that atonement and that sacrifice was on our behalf. Maybe it even expands on its importance.
I think so.
All right. Well, good. I think, is there anything else you want to add to that one?
Not really, not at the moment.
Okay. All right. I want to go next to plural marriage. Okay. Because this one here gets, I think sometimes the worst, well, maybe not the worst anymore, not since Banner of Heaven just came out, but gets one of the worst raps as far as fundamentalist doctrine. How could that possibly lead us back to Christ? Because as the world looks at it, well, that's about a guy being able to satisfy every carnal desire he wants by having more than one wife. So what would you say it is about plural marriage that anchors us to Christ?
I love it. I think the best way to approach it is share some more history from my side of the family, where I began to realize that it did. The moment that I truly realized that it was supposed to do that. I was sitting on the couch in the den in my house in Seattle before I moved to South Dakota, before I moved to Missouri, and my mom comes in. I'm just laying down. Maybe I was on my phone or reading a book, just laying down on the couch. And so I'm 24, turning 25, not married, And my mom comes in and she says, I just hope that you can find a girl who loves the gospel as much as you do. And I said, well, Mom, then you need to pray and ask the Lord to send me a girl who loves who believes what I believe about the gospel. And she goes, well, I'm not going to ask the Lord to send you someone who believes in polygamy. And I just said, well, I didn't bring up polygamy, but now that we're talking about it, Mom, why can you consider this perspective? Why can't we talk about D&C 132 and how it's supposed to bring us closer to the Lord? Why can't we talk about how it's a revelation given to Joseph Smith at the end of his life to teach his contemporaries? And I don't believe that God would reveal a principle to Joseph Smith that was not supposed to teach us about how to come unto Christ. So can't we at least have this conversation about how living this law is supposed to help us be better at living the gospel? And that those words just kind of came out of my mouth. I wasn't planning it. It was completely instigated by this conversation from my mom. But I was like, yeah, that's true. Why can't we at least talk about how Joseph Smith didn't reveal principles that weren't going to teach us about who Christ was or about how we can be closer with the Lord? And the answer, I think, and I'm people who have more than one wife, please forgive me, because I'm not living that law. I'm 3 months married. I know I am not an expert whatsoever, and so take a load of salt with this, but I am quickly perceiving in my own life that knowing the gospel by precept is one thing and applying it by example is another thing. And I thought I had the gospel pretty well down, knew the doctrines, knew the history. I think I have it by precept, but in the last 3 months, I have struggled more than I have ever struggled in trying to live the gospel by example. And I can only imagine how hard that is in a plural marriage, where you have to be just to all sides, where women will completely take the side of their children when you have all the children from 3 different women arguing against each other, and you have to be the guy arguing, standing on principle, and 2 of your women are going to be mad at you because they're just going to take the sides of the kids. Yeah, I can understand the heartache that goes with that, and that strength, and you have to be on principle, and you have to be on it by example. Otherwise, they're not going to follow you. If you're not living it by example, not just by correct precept. And I think that's probably I've seen women who are super keenly understanding intellectually and by precept and can learn something, but I think most of them feel it, and and that's the struggle for men, is to feel it. And so with plural marriage, it is putting you in that position where you feel more keenly after Christ and how to be forgiven of your sins, because darn it, you're going to mess up trying to execute righteous judgment and mercy, all at the same time, and so you're trying to figure this out. And the only answer I can have is that plural marriage is forcing the man, if he's righteous, to seek the Lord and to live all the other principles of the gospel, not just talk it.
No, that's good. I'll share a little bit from mine, and I've tried not to make this podcast about me.
Sure.
And again, take this with a load of salt, because obviously my attempt at plural marriage did not work out, right? Let me say that from the beginning. However, from having lived it for right around 6 years, here's what I noticed. This one's, I won't say easy for me to see the connection, but because I've experienced something with it, I can see how it works. First off, there's a dynamic there, right? And I remember, and I'm just going to call her Carol, my second wife who ended up leaving, because I want to protect her anonymity, because I believe she's still in the LDS Church. But with Amber, I saw so much Christ-like love for her sister. Not her literal sister, but her sister wife, right?
Sure.
Because there would be times that Carol would suffer from really horrible nightmares. And she would text Amber when it was Amber's night. I don't know if I did it right, but I went every other night, right? I spent every other night at with each wife. But there would be times it would be, midnight, and I'm with Amber, and Carol would call and or text just saying, hey, can you talk for a second? Because I had a bad nightmare. And rather than Amber talk to her, she would wake me up and be like, you need to go see Carol. You need to go spend time with her because she's hurting right now. And there were so many times that went back and forth with that Christ-like love, right? I mean, and seeing how they looked out for each other. And it was that way. The other thing is that the way they each mothered their own children, right? They really did integrate as far as that goes. And that created this extra layer of security. I remember once one of my biological kids, Amber was off working, and he had done something. He was riding his bike and really scraped himself up, and I'm trying to doctor him up. And he's like, I'm just going to go see Carol because I really don't trust you as much as I do her. Right. Wow. And so the kids felt it, right? There was just this increase of love. And then I think the other way it really anchored me personally to Christ was there was a time when before I entered into plural marriage, I'd play golf. I would, go shooting at random when I wanted, right? Because everything was taken care of at home. It wasn't like I was neglecting Amber, but when Carol comes along, now it's double, right? Now I'm fixing 2 sinks essentially, or whatever the case may be. And so I have to be more selfless, right? I have to be more willing to put aside my desires for the well-being of the family, right? And in that surrendering of what I wanted to do, not what I needed to do, what I wanted to do, I found a deeper love than I knew I was capable of. And I remember it very keenly once in one experience where, and it was so simple. It wasn't anything grand, or, in terms of a religious epiphany, but I was at the grill. And again, if you could see my size, I'm at the grill a lot, but I'm at the grill and I'm flipping burgers, and Carol's kids are playing with our kids, me and Amber's kids, and Amber and Carol are just off laughing and talking. And I just took in the scene. And I'm sorry. I took in the scene, and I'm like, this is it. This is what this is all about. And in that moment, I didn't care I didn't golf anymore. I didn't care that I didn't have perceived freedom any longer, or a level of freedom. It paled in comparison to that moment where everything seemed right, and there was so much love everywhere on those couple acres that I didn't care. The other thing that I think it did in terms of anchoring me to Christ is I was forced to surrender my ego. I was forced to lay my ego down. And it came, that realization came when we were all planning this vacation. And I kept trying to, say, no, let's not do this. Let's do this. And it just kept getting worse and worse. And then I was so thankful I listened at that moment, because I try to listen to the Spirit as much as I can, but I'm human and I'm flawed, and I sometimes don't listen. But in that moment, I listened when the Spirit said, stop, just be quiet. And then Amber and Carol worked out all the details, and it was one of the best vacations we ever had, right? And the thing is that I wasn't involved. Now, that's not to say you just always not be involved. There were times I had to make the decision because there was a deadlock, right? And then normally I knew I made the right decision because they were both mad at me. So, but in that moment, right, not everything needs my fingers in it, so to speak. Every decision doesn't need me there. And it forced me to surrender my ego and understand that, hey, you're real, surrendering the ego allows you to really start to see the love of God a little more in full view, or in technicolor, if you will.
No, I think that's right. My comment on that, what you're saying, if I'm interpreting you right, is that plural marriage in a celestial capacity is going to put each individual, the man and the women, in their own personal Garden of Gethsemane, where they are as Christ is, on their knees, having their ego die in front of them, and they're saying, "Not my will be done, but let Thy will be done, Father." And let the will of God be done for the benefit of my family, not my desire, but whatever I can do to benefit the whole family is what I'm going to do. And it requires that of every single individual in the marriage.
Yep. And the most interesting thing is like I said, in that experience I had where I was watching Amber and Carol talk and laugh and the kids play, you don't care anymore, right? You're experiencing such an abundance of love in those moments that you just don't, you're like, I can't believe I found pleasure in golfing, right? I can't believe and it's not to say golf is bad, right? It's just, there are higher things, and those higher things will always require more sacrifice, because as I believe it was Thomas Paine who said this. I love this quote where he says, heaven knows how to affix a price to her gifts, right? And if that was the price, I'd pay it 10 times over without thinking twice.
That's awesome.
So anything else you want to add to that one?
No, I think that covers it. I'm not an expert on living that. I could just tell you that, and share my testimony, and through the things that I'm suffering too, is learning how to be married after 26 years nearly of being a single guy is if you don't seek the Lord, seek the Spirit, try to understand the character of God, the character of Christ, and emulate them yourself, I cannot even see a prosperous marriage, period.
Let me say this. I've been married to Amber. It'll be 27 years in November. That's a process, right? That's not something that just comes. That's a process.
Right. And so each party has to, I think the beautiful part about it is, if the gospel is being lived and each person has an understanding of the atonement, and that the other person is trying, that they're not perfect, that we can forgive each other as we're learning through that process, then you can grow into something beautiful.
No, I totally agree. All right. Law of consecration. This one's kind of I feel like this one's the easiest one to get there, to say, how does that anchor us to Christ? Go ahead.
Law of consecration, it's not united order. It's not the same thing. Some people, especially when you get into fundamentalism, in the history, and you go to the Colorado City history, they wanted to establish this united order down there that was after this pattern of Orderville, but in Orderville down in southern Utah, but it was a kind of a system. It was almost communistic, where it was they decided what you wore, what you did, and what you'd eat and when you'd eat. That kind of stuff. And so that was kind of the pattern that was given in the early fundamentalist movement. That this is law of consecration. It's like, no, that's a model of a united order, and I don't think it's the best model. I haven't studied this too much, but by contrast, you have the Brigham City United Order, which was, I think, led by Lorenzo Snow, which was based more off of a free market system, and it was way less domineering in your personal life, and it was also equally as prosperous. And so thinking on that, and realizing that there's a distinction between consecration, which you covenant to live in the temple covenants, and a united order, I kind of coined my own phrase based off of what the Lord says in the Gospel of Mark. He says that man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And so in that instance, it's like law of consecration was not made for United Order, but United Order was made for law of consecration, wherein the United Order becomes a vehicle, a covenant that you can make with other brothers. It's a marriage of men and families, to help you live consecration. But you don't technically need the formality even to live consecration. And it becomes even more interesting more and more as fundamentalist groups divide and things become more and more out of order. When there's no organ, how do you keep your temple covenants when you don't have an organization to pay tithing to or donate to, or and you very much have to do things by the spirit of the law and say, okay, Lord, I have an excess of who do I need to bless? Who do I need to help? Who can I give this to? And then you have to pray for guidance and maybe give, service. And if there is, and if you are part of a community or part of a covenant group that, where you are doing those things, then I think you're truly blessed. I wish that's one law that I truly want to live. I should have pulled up something, from a brother who was quoting Orson Pratt, where Orson Pratt talked a lot about law of consecration in the Journal of Discourses, and he said that essentially you're going to get a lot of people who are going to look and say, is their order going to make money? How much money are they going to make in their business before I join the order? But that's not what the order is about. The order is it's not about making money. First off, that's another thing. It's not about making money. It is a program to teach you to perceive and love the way that Christ loves, right? And so what happens if you're part of a United Order and the business that you have together fails? Does that mean that the United Order fails? No, it means do something else. Try again. The covenant, and to me, is more important. And living it for that reason is far more important than the temporal thing that you do to kind of facilitate the covenant.
Right. So I'm going to try to tell you how I perceive it, and then because I think we're saying the same thing here. So you have law of consecration and a United Order. I look at the law of consecration like the principles, right? If you will, the law of consecration would be, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example. It would be like the Constitution of the United States, right? Now, the mechanisms that grow out of that would be considered the United Order, right? That's the framework in which those principles are implemented for the benefit of that society. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I don't want to interrupt what you're saying, but no. I have something brilliant, I think. No, so my father, like I said earlier, he was so infatuated with the idea of being able to live the United Order with his sons in the future, even in the church, because that's what you covenant to do. And we're not doing that. Let's live our covenants, But he would always say when I was growing up, the philosophy behind this is realizing that you don't own anything. All things are owned by the Lord, and you are a steward of the Lord. And so then you go back to these parables in the New Testament about the 1, 5, and 10 talents, things like that. When that becomes your perspective on life, law of consecration becomes, I think, exciting, but it also becomes understandable when you realize that I am trying to improve upon what the Lord's stewardship is, or ownership is. And the promise is, if you do that, you will obtain your own, talents, or you will then in the future be able to be a possessor of all that the Lord has. That's consecration as well, is that that's part of the promise, is we covenant in this life through the temple to give our all to the building up of the kingdom of God upon the earth. And God's covenant to you back is that you get to be the possessor of all that I have and all that the rest of the gods have. Right.
Yeah.
That's the other side of the coin that I don't think it's looked at, is that if you live that law, the promise is that you will also be the possessor of everything.
Well, and look, I've seen people in a united effort, right? And they do a pretty darn good job of it. But I could see how that would try a person, right? I could understand, because you're going to work shoulder to shoulder with people. And as we know, every person comes with their own worldview and their baggage that goes along with that, right? I'm probably the guy toting the most baggage in that kind of scenario. And so when I see it working like it does with the church I go to, it's astounding, right? Because you have to check your ego, right? You have to be able to say, this is just what needs done, and got to do it, right? And in doing that, you learn two important lessons, I think, so far from what I've been able to observe. And again, I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination. I don't want anyone to think that I'm remotely close to being at that level. But what I noticed is that once that ego gets checked, the flaws of others are easily overlooked, right? Once you check your ego and your ego is no longer guarding your flaws, because that's really what an ego does, right? It allows you to kind of cover up to yourself your own flaws. Once that ego's done and you realize, ooh, I got some stuff I got to work on here, all of a sudden you don't care about somebody else's. And it's a lot easier to extend charity and forgiveness and this idea that maybe even the other guy's perceived flaw is a weakness in your thinking, right? And in doing that, and this is just what I've observed. Again, I haven't hardly at all lived this. I've helped out a few times. That's it. What I've seen is that there's a brotherly love that happens when that kind of syncs up, right? And you can get a lot done if that's the case. And I'm not saying that anybody's perfect at it. And like I said before, I am certainly far down on the list because, like I said, I've helped out 3 or 4 times is all. But I can definitely see that again, once you surrender that ego and you understand that you have your own flaws and you start forgiving your brethren of theirs in this effort, this united effort, all of a sudden you start feeling the bonds of brotherly love in a much more powerful way.
Yeah, I love that. And if you don't have the faith in the system, it's not going to work for you either, because you're not going to be able to give it all that it will require if you don't have the faith for it, right?
Right.
If you don't believe that this is the way that the gods live, if this is the way that Christ would live if he was here, if you don't have that kind of faith, what's it going to do for you? You're not going to get the blessings from it.
Right. Right. Well, and that's just it, right? Let's go to the Pearl of Great Price, where the Lord says, this is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. It's a selfless effort, right? There's nothing in there where God is like, I'm doing this so I can have kids that will stroke my ego one day. No, he's like, no, the whole reason I am here doing this is because I love my children. I think a united order gets us, and law of consecration helps get us to that point while in mortality, because you're not centered on the self, you're centered on others. And when that compassion happens, you know, it's very much a type of, well, not just a type, it is very much a Christ-like attribute. Right. It's
such a trial too, especially for men. It's like the counter to plural marriage for men, you know, of where man has to share his labor and even his, you know, the works of his hands, whatever they may be, whether it's monetary or actual creations and labor, you know, the works of his hands get shared with other families, and that is something that we covet and protect. You know, we are engineered to fight for personal, you know, be territorial. Men are territorial, right? And so to expand and kind of peel that back and say, look, brother, I love you. Let me use my hands and impart my substance to you, where you begin to feel something positive instead of this guarded territorial feeling that's very, very base and instinctual according to the natural man. Yeah, it's very much, I think, akin to the women peeling back their territorial nature in a marriage to their husband as well.
Yeah, no, I could totally see that. And just from my own experience, right? I mean, I'm a guy who doesn't have a lot to offer, right? I'm kind of good at surveying, right? And land surveying. So when I'm able to go out there and provide that service, I feel like I'm contributing. I feel good about it when it's all done, right? If I was to go to my actual job and they're like, hey, we're not going to pay you, I'd be a little pissed, right? So it's a completely different thing. And because you realize, okay, this is what I can contribute. This is what he can contribute. Now, his isn't more important than my, well, his might be more important, but mine's definitely not more important than his, right? And so in that sense, I mean, yeah, I feel like you can contribute to that. And when you do that, I don't know, it's a different feeling, man. It's a different feeling. I to be honest with you, I didn't expect to have it. I'll be honest. In fundamentalism, that was the thing I was the most worried about, right? Is that sure. I wouldn't be able to do that. But on the few times I did, there was such a Christ-like love in those moments at times that I could totally see how that law of consecration and working within a united effort or a united order can definitely anchor a person back to Christ.
Yeah, I think so too. And look at the opposite. When you're spending all your time laboring for money, how do you feel compared to you don't feel anything?
No.
Sure, you get some satisfaction maybe that you're putting bread on the table for your family, but you get nothing out of pursuing money. And the scriptures talk about that. The laborer who labors for money shall perish, and the laborer who labors for Zion, shall prosper, or however that's worded. And I like Hugh Nibley. Hugh Nibley had a lot of good things to say about United Order and law of consecration. And it's going to escape my mind here. He said, all must work, but the lunch is free. But what right. kind of work?
I've heard that. Yeah. Yep, exactly. I think so. I'm going to tell a story here of sure. a kid that I knew, because you bring up an important point that all must work. Mm-hmm. I worked at a company who his mom was a secretary there, and she had a son who had Down syndrome. And I was overseeing about 4 or 5 crews, and she's like, he's scared of going anywhere else to a job because he's worried he's going to get ridiculed or whatever. She's like, he needs to do something. We don't have to pay him, but can he work with you when you have stuff to do? Because we get in great big shipments of lath and, hubs and stakes and paint and flagging and all the stuff surveyors need. And I was like, yeah, he can do that. Absolutely. And I'll make some room in the budget and get him a paycheck, and this will be good. And his name was Bryant, and Bryant came to work. And when he first came into my office, he was so timid. So you could tell he just felt like he didn't have a lot of worth. He apologized a lot for not doing anything wrong. Sure. And so one day I took him out there and I said, okay, here's what you're going to do, Brian. I'm putting you in charge of the supplies, right? So just count up these supplies. And when it gets to this number, come tell me and I'll order more. And it's up to you to put it away. And if you need help, come get me and I'll come help you. And he was like, I don't know if I can do that, Dave. That seems to be above me. And I'm like, Bryant, I think you're going to do great. I think you can do this. And so he started doing that week after week. And then one day I noticed he just came to the office and he was smiling and he was happy. And I was like, man, you seem chipper today. What's going on? And he goes, I have something to do with people I think that love me. And too often we look at work in the society that we live in now. And again, it's not a horrible way of doing it. I mean, outside of a united order, I think capitalism is probably the most beneficial system there is to everybody involved. But in that moment, I realized that work was more than just about collecting a paycheck. It was about an individual's ability to feel like they were of worth, that they were of importance. And you get that feeling whenever you do. And again, I haven't done it a lot, but in the times I've been there to help out, I have felt that same thing. And I think it's important to note that if there's another thing that Law of Consecration and United Order does, it's give people a sense of worth and value and importance.
Absolutely. I love that. It brings me to remember something that a brother in this community said. He says, we reproduce after our own image. And so just like God reproduced us in his image, if you're a carpenter, you reproduce carpenters. You know, when you work with other brothers, and even in a united order capacity, you know, if you're a painter, you're gonna reproduce other painters. If you have a company, what's gonna happen is you're gonna work with these brothers until they, you know, as apprentices. When they're apprentices, then they're gonna become journeymen or masters. And then what are they gonna do? They're gonna split off and start their own companies. And there's not anything wrong with that. You've now successfully trained up someone into godhood, essentially, you know, speaking gospel wise. But now they're self-sufficient. But imagine how beautiful it could be if it's outside of Babylon, where now they're your competition because they're starting their own company, but that you work together and you have this united order, you know, and now he running double the capacity, you know, with his company and your company, you now have double the manpower, right? You can take on bigger jobs, you can take more jobs faster, you know, and it benefits the whole order to do it that way, right?
Right. And that was another point that I heard someone make when talking about this, was that oftentimes your horizons are going to broaden, right? Because maybe one day you have to get inside the backhoe to dig something, right? To put in a trench somewhere. Or one day you may have to figure out how to be a stonemason, right? Whatever it is, in that united effort, there's going to be times where if a brother is sick, if a brother can't make it, if a brother has gotten to the point to where it just hurts too bad, right, to actually do the labor, you're going to have to do it. Yep. And I think the other thing it does is it creates natural affection. Look, anytime someone teaches you something from a position of love, it's only natural to build some sort of relationship, some sort of rapport with that individual, because he took time to teach you and you took time to be quiet enough to learn. And that builds love and respect and Christ-like bonds.
Amen to that. I love it.
So, all right, you ready to move on to another one?
Sure.
The endowment. How does the endowment anchor us to Christ?
Oh, I love this one. Okay. I was actually given some thoughts on this. So, where to start with that? Okay. So, on my mission with the church, I encountered an artist who I guess will probably remain unnamed, although he was drawing or painting rather. He had several paintings depicting restoration type events or themed paintings, and one of them was mind blowing, and it was in it was a resurrected Savior, that he was depicting in this painting, and his hands are outstretched, in a way where you can clearly see the palms, and in his hands I saw a compass and a square, where the marks, like they were marks, they were cut, into his flesh there, but they were not holes per se, but there was cuts in his flesh in the shape of a compass and of a square, with that open bird's mouth shape. Gotcha. And I asked him about that, and he says, "Oh, you recognize that, do you?" And he says, "Well, I don't know why I did this, but when I was preparing to paint this, it was impressed upon my mind to take some steaks or whatever, some cut of meat, and to pound some nails, some big old nails through this slab of meat. And when he removed the nails, he was surprised that it did not create a puncture hole, but that the wound closed back up, and that the shape of the wound was that open bird's mouth shape. And it was impressed upon his mind that the garment marks were literally represented by those two in any case are representative of Christ's wounds in the flesh. I think it's incredibly interesting. It's been in Galatians, and Paul says, "Henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of my Lord Jesus Christ." Super interesting. So what is it talking about there? Does Paul have the marks of, did he crucify himself to have the marks of Christ in his flesh? Or is he saying, "Let no man trouble me because I'm wearing the garment of the holy priesthood and I have the marks of the crucifixion on me"? And especially with a navel mark, and with Christ being jabbed in his side with a spear, and it. I was shown, and this bears out, and I think the source was in the Nauvoo Endowment companies, where there was a Bishop George Miller points out that same verse, and he says, "Now this was the closest that the Apostle Paul would dare allude to these things in writing, but the garments that we wear now have the marks that he's referring to." And so to me, it was this mind-blowing moment when I saw that, and I had that story, this encounter that I had with this artist on my mission, years early, or like 6 years earlier, completely
Wow.
blew my mind.
See, yeah, I never caught that in Galatians where Paul says, "I have the marks." I'm sure I read it probably 1,000 times and figured he was speaking figuratively of
Right.
Christ's countenance or whatever. But that could make some sense that he has the marks of Christ, he may be wearing the garment.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think it's really interesting how he says, "Henceforth let no man trouble me," right? And I think some fundamentalists get in trouble for wearing the old style garment, I
Right.
think it's funny how he says that, "Henceforth let no man trouble me."
Right.
Get out of my face about it or something. I don't know.
No, that's a very interesting point. And I guess the other thing that I feel comfortable talking about here are the covenants we make, right? Because,
sure,
without talking about the delivery method or anything like that, but as you look at the covenants we make in the temple, I can't think of any that are self-aggrandizing, right? So we think of like the law of sacrifice, right? That's sacrificing. That's an outward giving, right? Go on to the law of chastity, right? Don't get me wrong, we benefit from leading a chaste life, but also we're not hurting our spouses, right? That's an injunction to guard the family, to guard that sacred unit, to put aside your own selfish desires and the lustfulness of your flesh, so that you preserve the tender feelings of your spouse. Law of consecration, right? That has nothing to do with your own benefit. Now, because of the way God works, we know that all of those things that we do do benefit us in some way, but by and large, those are outward things that we do for others, right? Look past your first time through the temple. Every time after that, you go for somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're
Right.
not making those covenants all over again. You're doing it for somebody else. You are doing.
That's a beautiful thing right there.
Right.
And that's what President Brigham Young talked about, President Joseph Smith talked about, and what the scriptures talk about is being a savior on Mount Zion.
Yep.
That's what that refers to, is going through the temple and making those covenants on behalf of your dead ancestors and friends so that they can be co-heirs with you. That's a beautiful thing. That's because that's what Christ did for us, is he made us co-heirs with him.
Right. And I can't think of anything more Christ-like than doing something for somebody else that they can't do for themselves. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we couldn't atone for our own sins. I mean, the closest we could come before Christ to having our sins remitted was animal sacrifice. And mm-hmm. even that was a type in the shadow pointing towards what Christ would ultimately do for us.
Yeah, right? that was only to show symbolically that for man to, because what Christ asked the Nephites was, you need to sacrifice a contrite heart, broken heart and a contrite spirit. So when you take that with animal sacrifice, it seems to me symbolically the Lord, by instituting that, was saying, you are killing the natural man. You are killing that beast that you're killing is actually the natural man. That's what you need to kill. That's what this symbolizes on the altar right here. And that's what Christ asked for when he abolished the law of sacrifice, was he made it more clear that I am asking you to break your heart and be more contrite, be spiritual, and sacrifice the animal that is within you instead.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I look at the endowment as a whole, and it's first, kind of putting us under covenant to obey God, right? Mm-hmm. And then all the subsequent covenants we make really tie closely into, well, not closely, almost entirely into how we treat others.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to me that on one level Christ is saying, yes, here's my grace, and here are the conditions for being completely forgiven by the Father if you keep my commandments, right? But then that's not enough, and Christ has to go further and the priesthood has to go further in giving these oaths and covenants in the temple that teach you how to live according to the life that you will need to live in order to be in his presence again. And that's what the temple is for. And what those oaths and covenants are for is, now you're going beyond grace and you're going to what Christ said, be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. These are the social laws that are going to teach you how to be perfect, so that by the time you die and obtain your resurrection, you know how to live in the society of the gods.
Right, exactly. And you can't get that without instruction, without making those solemn covenants, right? Because unless we have that upon us, right, constantly written in our hearts and in our minds, that this is how you attain to what our Father has, you have to become like Christ. You have to start striving towards that. Now, I'm not saying that either of us will ever come close to what Christ is, but we at least need to have those ideas in mind and start taking those steps. And
yep, we do.
And the function of the endowment is to get you there, right? To start you down that road, to start you thinking, how is it I turn my thinking? When you take into account that all of those covenants we make are selfless covenants within the temple, that they are to guard those we love and care about and want to work with, it can't do anything but anchor you back to Christ.
Yeah, when you look at the millennial prophecies from the Old Testament, it's so interesting to me that when the Lord's talking about preparatory to the millennium, he says that my law will be written in their hearts, and how the endowment, as you're saying, it causes that change of heart where if you internalize those covenants and start going down that path, like, you won't become exactly perfect as Christ is, but if you have that change of heart and it's written on your hearts, the Book of Mormon says that when you die, the spirit that you have is what you have in the next world too. And so if you don't have that written on your heart, you can't be going the same direction that God wants you to go to. And so the endowment is to help facilitate that change. Secondly, the other millennial prophecy regarding Elijah in Malachi talks about hearts too. It says, behold, I reveal the priesthood by the hand of my servant Elijah, and he will plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the fathers will turn to their children, lest I come and the earth be utterly wasted at my coming. And so it's so, I don't think the Lord's a liar, and he says the earth will be wasted. What does that mean? It means even the atonement of Christ can't do, saving us from our sins individually is one thing, but if we do not prepare our hearts to live with God, it's wasted.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so often, I think this especially, it took me years of going to the LDS temple to figure some stuff out, right? I don't think that it was particularly instructive, right, about why we made the covenants we made inside the temple within the LDS Church. They just left it at, it was necessary or something like that, right? This will prepare you for godhood. Well, how does that work? How does that mechanism work? Explain to me how it is that by living consecration, that living chastity, anchors me to Christ. Well, again, it's looking outward rather than inward, bridling your lustful desires, bridling your desire to gain wealth and riches. It can't help but force you to look beyond yourself, and in that looking beyond yourself and caring more about others around you. That's Christ-like in its definition.
I agree.
So, Michael, I want to take just a few minutes here, and I want to talk a little bit about priesthood and how priesthood can anchor us to Christ. I think oftentimes we look at priesthood as simply a hierarchical structure that is just meant to govern. Well, it is meant to govern, but that's not the sole purpose, right? Precisely. That's not it at all. If you're obtaining priesthood to obtain power and dominance, you are sadly mistaken. This is a servant's role, right? Yep. And the only way that priesthood can function effectively is in a servant's role. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's administration within the kingdom that has to be done. Right. But that administration, but servitude should never suffer for administration.
No, and I have a mentor in the priesthood out here who I would consider my file leader honorably. I love something that he says. He says, "No one's first on the freeway."
Right.
Right. And so if you look at the priesthood as an endless line of authority, we trace our, everyone who's ordained in the church can trace their priesthood back to the three witnesses and then Joseph Smith, right? And then Christ and all that. But it goes on far, far longer than that, right? It goes through the worlds, and so you have this huge long freeway with all these cars representing each individual on the chain. No one's first because there's going to be a lot of people. There's going to be as many people after you if you're faithful as there is above you.
Yeah. Yep.
No one's first on the freeway. The blessings are the same. Just get in the car and go on the destination. Get to the destination.
No, that's exactly right. And I get the administration side of it, and it has to be there, right?
It has to be. And that's supposed to teach you too how to be
right,
governed before you can govern and become a
right,
god.
right, exactly. But when the idea of servant leadership suffers for administration, that's a sad state of affairs. And I think we can see that really strongly within the mother church, if you will, right? Where the honors and titles of men have found their way into priesthood offices. And it's a sad state of affairs. Because here's the thing, what do men do with that priesthood, right? By and large, that you don't get priesthood for yourself. You get priesthood to bless the lives of somebody else. Whether
yes, and if you don't do it, where are your blessings?
Right, exactly. You get the priesthood to administer the sacrament as the sons of Aaron did at the altar of sacrifice, right? You get the priesthood to be able to bless your children and your wife, to provide them with comfort and healing. You get priesthood to administer the blessings of the temple, to instruct people on how to approach godliness.
That's another thing I'd
go
like
ahead.
to touch on too, with especially regarding higher principles and higher blessings. The mindset is, the attitude should be, how can I help everyone keep the covenants that they've made? Also, what does it mean to magnify your priesthood? We hear that in the church, probably in fundamentalism too, magnify your priesthood. And you think it's, do a good job in your calling. No, it means, when you look at magnifying talents in the scriptures, it means to make more. That with that parable in the New Testament, 5 turns into 10 and 10 turns into 50 or whatever it was, right? Or however that goes. And if you're not making more priesthood with your priesthood, are you magnifying the priesthood? If you're not administering the covenants and standing as an administrator, as a legal administrator, I think you're going to be held accountable for withholding opportunity for people to progress personally, because you're not magnifying your talents. And what did the Lord say when he came and found that servant, saying, "You've hid your talent. You did nothing with the priesthood. You didn't you did not ordain anyone else."
Right. The other thing that I think we got to talk about with priesthood, or at least maybe just me, I don't know what your situation is when I was first coming into the branch and exploring fundamentalism, I kept coming across the term file leadership, right? Mm-hmm. Who's your file leader? And I was like, okay, here we go. We're going to start down the path of oppression and, and having someone over you, lording it over you. I am so fortunate that because it was explained to me, you'll have a file leader and he'll help you, right? And I'm like, well, I guess we'll see. And I had a pretty profound experience when praying if I should join the branch. It's one that I don't think I'll ever share, but with a few, because it was so profound. But I had to take that on faith to do it, right? Because every inclination was like, ooh, I don't want to do this. But it seemed the answer was, it was correct. And so when I received a file leader, and I'm not going to say his name because I don't know if he'd be comfortable with it, so I'm going to leave it out. But he knows who he is. He has been nothing but loving and supportive and the opposite of tyrannical, right? He has been a counselor and a close friend and a confidant, and I see the wisdom in it, right? I absolutely see the wisdom in it. I feel the love from file leadership, and I feel like if there's one thing the LDS Church could really take away from fundamentalists, it's this idea of file leadership.
I think so too. I absolutely agree. My father, speaking from my observation, was completely destitute of a mentor in the church, except for his father-in-law. So my grandpa, was essentially for many years his file leader, but now he has none. really. Grandpa's still alive, but he doesn't really function the same way. He's old.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think you're completely right. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with file leadership either. In fact, I'll share a little quote from the file leader of my file leader, who's dead now as well. His name was Jackson Ted Jessup. And he said, "My greatest fear for this people is that they will either become a dictatorship or they will become too independent to take righteous counsel."
Right.
And boy, if that's not the state of fundamentalism in a nutshell right now, I don't know what is.
Yeah, because we have to be able to take that, so because it's a two-way street, right? On one hand, the responsibility I can tell by the good example I have of file leadership is this is someone who loves you, who cares about you, who takes this responsibility very seriously. The other side of that is the other individual's willingness to put his ego on the altar again and say, you know what, you probably have some wisdom there that I really need to take some counsel from. And when that happens and both approach it from a space of love, you can't help but be benefited by it on both sides. There's something that happens, I think, within this structure, this priesthood structure, where a person begins to have their own ministry, right? Because let's face it, the natural man does not want to minister to other people. He's like, I got to go get as much as I can. I have to build up. I have to do X, Y, and Z. But with this idea of servant leadership that the priesthood teaches us, well, that's a different beast entirely, right? That's something that fosters love, and leadership simply doesn't mean leading. It means ministering.
Yes, I think so. It's all about, it's just like I mentioned earlier in a marriage, living the gospel by example, not just by precept. A file leader or priesthood leader could say the same thing, right? Like, this is the doctrine, this is what you need to do, and not live it himself, right? And then what kind of relationship are you going to have if he's just telling you what to do or telling you what the doctrine is? But if there becomes a union of feeling between the two of you, that bond that's that bond that Christ is talking about in John 17, where you're becoming one.
Well, yeah, exactly. And you look at Christ's life, right? He's washing his apostles' feet.
Yes.
Right? He is washing their feet. He is healing people. He is raising people from the dead. He is feeding the masses. None of that is really self-aggrandizing.
No.
It's all outward expressions of love and concern for his brothers and sisters. And I think with priesthood, we men really need to understand that to really tap back into the power of the priesthood.
I agree.
So real quick, because I want to touch on this subject. I think within the LDS Church, somehow all the things we talked about today, right? About how these higher principles now, and I understand some of these higher principles aren't talked about anymore in the LDS Church, but these higher principles somehow have lost this connection back to Christ, right? Where they're almost esoteric. No one really talks about it.
Yes, that's true.
What can we do as fundamentalists to make sure we never fall into that trap?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I'll be able to give the greatest answer on the end of this deal here, but I think, one, you need to be in constant reminder of who you're emulating as a priesthood holder. Like you just said, like you need to remind yourself that you are trying to follow the footsteps of Jesus Christ, in his mediating position, and you become a mediator between God and your wives and your children, and you need to serve your wives and your children like Christ would serve you. And you need to try to live as near as possible in every moment, I think, and try to say, what would Jesus do? It's that simple. And try to teach your children how to. My mind is blown right now with when I compare what I've seen in my father and mother's marriage and how well they live the gospel, and I never knew it. When they're not fundamentalists, but when I look at them living the gospel in their family life, oh my goodness, I've only been married for 3 months, and we're still, it's still brand new, and my mind is being blown, but they seem perfect compared to me looking at myself already in my marriage, that I know from their fruits, I was able to have a love of the gospel. I was able to have a love of the doctrine of Christ because of they lived that. They made that in their marriage. That they made that so important. And so by emulating the Savior in such a way that your children will love the gospel, and then begin to ask you, what does this mean when Christ says, "Be therefore perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect"? How can we be perfect? And then you can begin to explain to them, that's by oath and covenant, son. When you go to the temple one day, you will learn about that. That's exactly what Christ is talking about, is how to be, and you will be taught how you can be made perfect in the next life. Things like that, and be able to live in such a way that they can trust you when you tell them. And then, or they can remember things. Like I remember my father telling me about Isaiah, saying that 7 women would take hold of one man, and this would happen before before the beginning of the millennium. And I remember the things that they taught, and not to be so rigid in systematizing how Adam God fits with the scriptures, for example. It's not going to work. There's a lot actually in there, by the way. That could be a whole nother podcast. I think maybe you touched on that with Jacob, but there's a tendency to, I think, correct when you become a doctrinally minded person where it's very intellectual. Just be cautious not to fall away from the other side of emotion and being truly feeling after the hearts of other people around you.
I think you hit on a really big one right there, right? So often, and I think it's the nature of what we're in with fundamentalism, right? Because we constantly feel like we have to prove ourselves, right?
Right.
Because we have been challenged by the LDS Church to some extent of, well, explain to me how it is you feel like you can do these things and still teach these things. So we feel like we have to prove it, right? And to some extent we do. But if you're only getting it here in your head and not in your heart, you've lost it. Right?
Yep.
At that point, you might as well be an anthropologist as much as a priesthood holder.
I love that. That's perfect. That is a perfect analogy.
Because unless you feel it, you're really on the outside looking in as a social experiment. So you have to feel it. Now, having said that, once you feel it, I don't think there's anything wrong with digging deep and trying to prove your stance, right? I encourage that. I think that's definitely needed, but feel it first and then go after the intellectualism of it.
The Lord says to love him with all your heart, might, and mind. So you got heart and mind in there. That's so interesting to me. When you look at old theologians in the church, they were so good with describing both the heart and the mind. Cleon Skousen comes to my mind, where he talks about his journey in discovering what good does it do for a man to die on a cross for the whole world. What good does that do? Yes, I can feel sympathy for a man who dies on the cross, right? But what does it do? And so he does begin, as you say, to uncover and investigate the science, almost the theology, the logic, the philosophy behind how Christ, being hung on a cross, nails driven through his hand, through his suffering, how can it accomplish what it accomplished? And it is the way that he delivers his thoughts on that is so it feeds the soul, the heart, and the mind in such a degree that it's truly inspiring. But that's what we need to be about. And ask your children and ask your friends according to the kind of like the Socratic method. Like, ask them questions and in a way that makes them think about the answer, so that when they come to you and share their thoughts, that you can then share yours and about the gospel. I think that's the best way to teach the gospel in the family. That's how my father taught. He'd always ask questions. And dude, when I was young, it drove me nuts that he wouldn't give me the answer sometimes.
Right. I think also the one thing that I remember from my time in the LDS Church is it seemed almost like a checklist, right?
Yes.
Here's your punch list items that you need to do. And sometimes I think it got, don't get me wrong, Mormonism in its purest form is very goal oriented, right? I mean, we're trying to get someplace, but if we forget to enjoy the journey, I think we're going to really miss out. So the one thing I've told my son is, the one son that's still young enough that he goes with us when we go to church in Spanish Fork now, to the branch rather than the LDS Church. I'm like, don't look at these like a punch list item. Enjoy this. Enjoy these times. Enjoy this growth, right? I don't look at it as here, and here, that you're looking at it wrong, right?
Right, that you're running a race with the people around you too.
Right. Don't do that. Feel it and enjoy it, right? That's the other thing. I don't think that, look, living the gospel can be tough because it's challenging. It's designed to be challenging.
Yes.
But I equate it to working out, right? There are times when going to the gym just sucks, right? I don't like it. I'm making a more concerted effort to go to the gym. Getting up at 4:30 in the morning, staring at that clock, getting my shoes on, going outside when it's cold, getting in the cold car, driving to the gym sucks.
Yes.
But in the midst of working out, all of a sudden I enjoy it, right? The blood is pumping, I'm seeing gains, and it's fun. Right. And I think we need to look at the gospel much like that. Yeah, there's times it's going to be tough to stay motivated or tough to do these things, but you're also going to enjoy a lot of it.
Yeah, I like that analogy you bring up with working out. It's in the same instances in the gospel and with working out. You're competing against yourself,
right?
Your former self and no one else. You're competing against yourself.
Nope.
Just try to be better.
And enjoy it, right? I mean, there are things to be enjoyed here. I don't think God wishes us to be miserable. I think there's times of misery because this is part of the experience. But I think by and large, this is designed to bring us joy. And if we're not enjoying this, we're kind of missing the point.
Yep. And on top of that, and back to the original question, the thing I would say to people in the church is the thing that's wrong with removing things from the endowment and changing things in the endowment is that it is preventing you from learning how to grow and compete in that race and improve yourself to the best that you can improve yourself. You are removing the tools out of that gym to help be fit to be in a celestial glory. Not that you can't do it ultimately, but you are having the tools removed from you right now that teach you how to live in this life to be prepared to live with God the next. That's why it's so dangerous. And so
Right.
if you can look at it from that perspective, that's what we have to offer is when, we have, like you said, like the original endowment, as close as we can get back to that, we believe in that because we believe that the principles therein will help better exercise us towards the celestial glory. Same with plural marriage, same with law of consecration. These are the tools that help us understand who God is, understand who Christ is, and understand ourselves. And so why would you want anything less? Why would you want anything less that is not capable of giving you the strength to go through the veil?
Right. And I think that's part of the problem that the LDS Church is seeing now, right? Because they've kind of watered this down so much that and this isn't to slam on Protestantism, right? But it's just another church, right? I mean, it's gotten kind of that same feel. And as they lose people, I think it's largely because the gym is too soft, so to speak, right? Yeah. All they got in there now are 10-pound weights and a treadmill that doesn't really work beyond level 1.
Right. And the moment that you catch up to the personal record of the prophet, you're a dangerous man now, and you can't go beyond him.
Exactly.
Where a prophet's role is, he's not Christ. He's not the mediator between you and God. He is to help you get to be a mediator.
Yep.
He is there to help put you in that position to your family that Christ is relative to the whole family. Yep. And it's also his job to get to that same position for his family as well.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree with you more. So we've done here right at 2 hours and 11 minutes. So it's went by quick.
Just one thing I thought I'd share maybe.
Yeah.
About all of these things, like you just said, like what is the utility? Like you and I, you said, we come on the same ground. Like we identify with President Young because he was able to take almost abstract principles and concepts and apply them in a practical temporal nature and view things as spiritually and temporally as one great whole, right? Now, I sure love the man because of that. So these things, temple endowments, teaching you how to live the social laws to prepare you to know to live with God comfortably in the next life. Adam God, teaching you who God is and who you are, and who Christ is, and the role that Christ plays between the two of you. I think with all that in mind, it's. I hope that those who listen to this will then reflect on John chapter 17. Where Christ himself is giving this great, it's called the Great High Priest Intercessory Prayer. And he is praying that the 12 will be one with each other as he is one with his Father, and that also that they will be one with him as he is one with the Father. And so you have this covenant relationship being established that I think is typical, of us as well in the priesthood. When you live all the laws of God and obtain the blessings of it and are truly in the Spirit living the law, you are moving from priesthood to godhood, a body of priesthood to a body of godhood, because you have those two distinct bodies in the John 17 represented. You have the 12 representing the priesthood, and you have two members of the Godhead with Christ and with God. And so the entire point of priesthood is to move you into godhood, to become one, as the 12 were to become one with Christ and with God there. And so we are looking to become acquainted with the family tree of life, that Father Lehi saw, and obtain the fruit and the seeds of eternal life right there, and then you get to go plant it on a new world when you're a God, and then invite to your children, come partake of this. And then you get to do that forever if you keep your covenants. To me, that harkens back to what I said earlier, is that the blessings of of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the blessings of Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael. That you can, and it's so interesting to me that when you read Genesis 14 or 15, and God is telling Abraham that your seed will be more numerous than the stars of heaven. On another world, God the Father received that same promise from his God, saying that your seed will be as numerous as the stars of heaven. And that's the beauty of it, is we get to partake of that blessing, and others will get to partake of that, and we'll be grafted together. And that's the beautiful thing about that family tree of God right there, is the tree of life. And I think that I hope that image helps people understand what priesthood is for, and what our goal is.
All right. Well, Michael, I can't tell you how much it's meant to me that you came on. I think this has been a great conversation, and let's do it again.
I would love that. I'll think of something else to talk about, but let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it again. All right. Thanks, Mike.
Appreciate it, man.
God be with you, and see everybody next time.